All right, welcome back, guys. Today's presentation is going to be a little bit longer, but we're going to cover the expressed and implied powers of Congress. So some of this will be familiar from what we talked about with federalism previously, because we are talking about those expressed and implied powers that we get from the Constitution, right? So express powers of Congress. Congress, we know, has the power to tax. It's one of the greatest powers that they added as a result of the Constitution, because if you remember, it didn't exist in the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation, they had the power to request money, but no state's going to readily give up money, especially right after the Revolutionary War. So the national government, through request under the Articles of Confederation, received zero money during that period of time. The problem with that is, whether we like it or not, taxes do go towards things that we utilize. So things like law enforcement, things like municipalities, things like for the upkeep of infrastructure, all sorts of crazy stuff, public education that we wouldn't readily have available otherwise. Now, taxes are only allowed to be used for things that are for the common good. So the limits there, it has to be for public benefit. So taxes cannot be used, for example, for salaries of our congressmen and women. Taxes can't be used for private sector. But we'll see how that washes out with everything going on right now, because we do know that the government might possibly have to bail out a lot of industry right now with everything going on in the world today. So we might see some bailout stuff, which would then come into question the idea of public benefit. Is that bailout truly a public benefit, yes or no? Depending on who you are, you might argue either side. Now, we have two types of taxes that exist. We have direct taxes and we have indirect taxes. Direct taxes, the most easy one to realize, is income tax. If you have a job, which some of you do, your paycheck, when you get it, has state and federal income tax already taken out of it. So that's a direct tax. You don't even get that money in your hand before you pay that tax. It's taken out before you even receive it. Indirect tax would be like a sales tax. So sales tax, let's say, a good one would be sin tax. So sin tax is on anything that's detrimental to the environment. So like tax on tobacco products. So let's say you go to the gas station, you buy a pack of cigarettes. You purchase those cigarettes, you pay a sin tax on those cigarettes. Now that sin tax is indirect, because the gas station owner, he had to pay a tax on those cigarettes that he bought from the cigarette company. And the cigarette company had to pay a tax to the government to produce taxes, or I'm sorry, to produce cigarettes. So that tax is trickling down from the cigarette company to the gas station to you who is purchasing them. So that's an example of indirect tax. So money is the first express power that we're going to talk about. Another thing that we know that the national government's responsible for is producing money. They are the ones who decide what our money is, what it looks like. They created a single uniform legal tender, as we call it, across all 50 states, and it has to be accepted across all 50 states. So anywhere where you can purchase things, they have to accept our legal tender. They have to accept our currency. Even if you choose to pay for it in old pennies, which is a really, really jerk move, that business has to accept it, because it's our single uniform legal tender across all 50 states. So like if you get a traffic ticket and you're not real happy about it, you can go in and pay for it in all pennies, and they have to accept it. They're not gonna be happy about it, but they have to accept it. All right, borrowing money, the public debt. Let's take a look at that first. So the US national debt clock, right? So that's what we're at debt-wise right now, $23 trillion. If we were to break that down per person and pay it off today, that's $73,000 almost per person. That's including children. If we're just looking at taxpayers, it's $190,000 per taxpayer. So this is constantly going up, as you can see, at a rather rapid click. This has all changed kind of drastically because of everything going on with the virus right now and the concerns going on in our country, right? The amount of money that we're putting in towards defense and war, the amount of money going into Social Security and Medicare, the average savings per family, not a lot. Total personal debt, the average personal debt per citizen, $63,000. Something that many of you will be contributing to in the near future. Student loan debt is over $1 trillion, over $1.5 trillion. It's on average $37,000 per student. Average credit card debt. Now, if we go over here, our U.S. population, number of people in the workforce, official number of unemployed. This is actually going to be changing rather drastically with people that are out of work right now because of the virus. Number of millionaires we have in the country, number of recipients on food stamps in the country. This is a very cool site that I will let you guys look over on your own. It's kind of cool just to look at. A lot of cool information, and it does kind of show how our country deals with money. So we have an astronomical amount of debt in our name as a country. We practice more times than not what we call deficit financing. So since the Great Depression in the 1930s, there has only been 7 years in our nation's history since the 1930s where we made more money than we spent, which means we did not practice deficit financing. So most years in what we would call the last 90 years, we have spent more money than we have made. Now, any business doing that would be out of business. They wouldn't have been around for 90 years, right? Now, we have a lot of leverage as a country, right? Because we borrow money against our Federal Reserve, we borrow money against other countries, and other countries aren't necessarily going to call us on those loans, because if they were, that you then deal with the idea of like, are we going to pay that money back? Are we going to go to war? How is this going to be handled? So we know for a fact, like, we borrow a lot of money from China, and China's okay with that because we do a lot of business with China too. So a lot of it's a give and take, and we've lent a lot of money to a lot of countries too. We know that we helped most of Europe rebuild after the 2 world wars. Stuff like that. So we didn't collect necessarily on money borrowed as well. So there's a lot of question about the public debt. Is it as scary as it actually looks? Should we worry about it as much as we should? The answer is probably somewhere in the middle there. Yes and no, right? Bankruptcy law, that's set by our national government too. So if you were to file a bankruptcy as an individual or as a company, that has to be dealt with in a federal court. We learned that last chapter in the judicial branch, right? So commerce power. We talked about commerce power with the Supreme Court as well. We talked about a couple cases, Heart of Atlanta versus United States, for example. The national government is responsible for regulating interstate and foreign commerce. So any trade that happens across state lines or any trade that happens with a foreign country. 2 examples of that, Supreme Court wise, would be Heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States, which, if you remember, we covered that in our Supreme Court cases. So the idea that motels cannot restrict who stays at their motels because it is detrimental to the Commerce Clause, right? Gibbons versus Ogden was an argument between 2 New York steamboat companies. So they were responsible for steamboating people across the river there, going into and out of the city. One steamboat company wasn't kind of had the monopoly on it, and so what the national government came in and did is they said no one person can have a monopoly here. It travels across interstate waters, so as a result of that, nobody could have exclusive rights. New York gave the United States the exclusive rights to regulate interstate commerce. So defense powers. The declaration of war is held by the United States Congress. It is not a power reserved to the executive branch. That power was drastically taken away from the president as a result of the War Powers Resolution Act in 1973, which was a direct response to how our presidents handled the Vietnam War during that period of time. So the president does have the power to maneuver troops, station troops, make military decisions without congressional approval, but he does have to inform Congress, and he is limited as far as his time frame, as far as how long he can have troops stationed here, there, or elsewhere without congressional approval. But an official declaration of war is voted upon by the members of Congress, and we have not had an official declaration of war since World War II. We'll talk more about War Powers Resolution Act when we get to the president and the executive branch. Regulations. Congress has the power to regulate as far as naturalization goes, and naturalization would be the idea of handing out citizenship. Congress has the power to hand out citizenship to any immigrant. They set the standards, so on and so forth. The post office is run by the national government. So any crime against the post office, any crime regarding tampering with mail is actually considered a federal crime. Copyrights and patents. Copyrights and patents are both federal agency, the Federal Agency of Copyrights and the U.S. Department of Patents. Difference between the two: a copyright is held on like artistic material. So you can copyright a book, you can copyright music, you can copyright artwork, anything like that. Symbols, logos, stuff like that, they fall under what's called trademarks, which fall into copyrights as well. An example would be sophomore year, you guys all read Catcher in the Rye, right? The reason there's never been a digital version of Catcher in the Rye or a movie of Catcher in the Rye, if you remember, you had to read a paperback still, was because of copyrights. J.D. Salinger passed away in 2010, and he left all of the earnings to Catcher in the Rye to his children. And in his will, he stated that they're not allowed to sell the copyright, or they forego all of their inheritance. Copyright is good for the length of a person's lifetime plus 50 years. So we will not see a digital version of Catcher in the Rye or a movie version of Catcher in the Rye until 2060. So we'll be waiting for that, right? Patents, differently, are on intellectual material. So a good example of a patent would be pharmaceuticals, right? Medicine all carries patents. So when they come out with a new type of medicine that's patented, and it's an exclusive right to produce that medicine to the company that came up with the idea, right? They file for a patent. The same thing works for any type of technology, a new cell phone technology, a new machine, anything like that, code for a computer program, all that stuff can be patented, right? Patents are only good for 20 years. And the idea there is to avoid a monopoly. So you have intellectual privilege on this new idea for 20 years, and you can make as much money as you want on it for 20 years. But then your idea goes public and people can copy it, right? So the best example you see of that, again, is in pharmaceuticals. So like ibuprofen. Ibuprofen was patented for 20 years, and now you've got all the generic brands of ibuprofen. Myers does an ibuprofen, Walgreens does an ibuprofen, and it helps drive the price down. So it helps us as consumers, but it does hurt the individual who came up with the idea. Weights and measures. The national government sets our weights and measure system. So a pound is a pound in any state. A mile is a mile in any state. We use the standard American version. We do not use the metric version, which basically the entire rest of the world uses. And that's probably how it'll be forever, because it would be too costly at this point to switch over to metrics. Territory. Eminent domain. So the government has the power to take your property if they see that it is more beneficial to the public good than it is to you as an individual. So the government could come in and they could put a road through your front yard if they felt it was necessary, and they could prove that it was necessary. They could do the same thing with a railroad. They could do the same thing with a power line or anything like that. Now, the government does have to pay you what would be the fair market value for the property that they are taking over. So that's important to note. You can fight it. You can go to court and make an argument for it. But the fact of the matter is it's you versus the government. More likely than not, the court's going to side with the government. Now, even if you do fight it, the government still will pay you the fair market value. So I guess it's worth your while, if the property is that important to you, to take it to court. Judicial power. We've talked about this already. The national government, Congress, makes all federal courts except the U.S. Supreme Court. So everything underneath the U.S. Supreme Court is created by the federal courts, or I'm sorry, by, excuse me, the legislative branch, Congress. So this is the only one that's created by the Constitution, the U.S. Supreme Court. The power to create everything else, the courts of appeals, the district courts that we talked about, state and local courts, special courts, those are all created by Congress. They also decide and punish for federal crimes. So the punishment we know for federal crimes is as high as the death penalty. So we do carry the death penalty for crimes such as treason and things like that. If we were to get rid of the death penalty at a federal level, that would have to be a decision that's made by Congress. So now we're going to quickly go through the implied powers. So we're going to look at basically the same stuff we just looked at with the express powers, except now we look at them implied. So implied powers, remember, comes from the necessary and proper clause. And like the image here, it's the elastic clause. It's the ability for Congress to stretch those express powers that we just talked about. So examples of implied powers. We know that Congress has the power to deal with money. They can lay and collect taxes. They can borrow money. Laying and collecting taxes would be the idea that because Congress can collect taxes, which is expressed in the Constitution, they can also enforce punishment for failure to pay taxes. So if you commit tax fraud or tax evasion, it's punishable because of implied powers. Borrowing money. Because Congress, we know, has the power to borrow money, that gave them the power to create things like the Federal Reserve, which is a government agency that we borrow money from. Naturalization, the idea that Congress can create these standards for citizenship. They're responsible for deciding citizenship. As a result, they can create the citizenship test. So if you remember on day one, I made you guys take a citizenship test. That is an implied power that comes out of Congress. Because Congress has the power to declare war, they have the power to create things like the draft, create things like our military academies, so West Point, Annapolis. The idea of regulating commerce, because Congress has the power to regulate commerce, they have the power to decide things like tariffs. They decide things like taxes on exports, taxes on imports versus exports. They set all those standards at the congressional level. Those are all decisions that they get to make. The ladder of the law, right? That comes strictly out of regulation of commerce too. If we go back to the McCulloch versus Maryland case, which is depicted here in the cartoon. The establishment of post office, because the post office is a national agency, because it's controlled by Congress, they can set the standards as far as things that you can and cannot ship through the post office. Things that are considered flammable, toxic, or hazardous cannot be shipped through the U.S. Post Office. So that gets us through expressed and implied powers. So I know I kind of went quickly through those implied powers. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. But the idea here is not to know everything that I just went through, but to be able to look at these express powers and see like, okay, so Congress has the power to do things like this, or do things like this, or do things like this as a result of the Constitution. But we also know, because of this, they can stretch those powers. So that's the important thing to note with the implied powers, is that everything implied is just that. It's implied from a pre-existing power that was expressed. So stay safe, boys. I'll see you next time around. We'll go over non-legislative powers and how a bill becomes a law. All right, take care.